The air in Hive Primus is thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning promethium. Machinery groans like wounded beasts beneath endless tiers of grimy skyways, and the rhythmic hammering of servitors echoes through the iron bones of the city. This is a place where hope is rationed, and the living are as brittle as the rusted girders holding up the Underhive. Amidst the flickering glow of hollow signs, a single Astra Militarum patrol marches, their boots splashing through shallow pools of contaminated water. They are guardians of order in a world teetering on collapse, yet even their discipline cannot erase the whispers of rebellion, plague, and the unseen horrors lurking in the shadowed corridors. Every flicker of light is a promise of survival, or the herald of death. In the Underhive, every step is a gamble, and every shadow may conceal a knife, or something far worse. If the stench of industry, the rhythm of survival, and the looming presence of the Emperor's light call to you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you can journey deeper into the worlds of the Imperium, where stories of grit, despair, and unwavering duty await in every hive, every manufactorum, and every shadowed alley. The air in Hive Primus was thick enough to choke, a dense, clinging mixture of soot, sweat, and promethium fumes that clung to every pore. From the upper echelons of the hive, where the sky barely leaked through the thick smog, down to the tangled underways where darkness was the only companion, life pressed inward on every living creature. The corridors groaned under the weight of machinery that never rested, hydraulic pistons hissing and screaming like wounded beasts as they obeyed the relentless cadence of the manufactorums. Servitors moved in synchronized, jerking rhythm, their heads bowed, cogitator eyes glowing faintly beneath rusted hoods, tendrils performing endless tasks with mechanical precision. To a newcomer, the hive might appear as a labyrinth of cold metal, but to those who lived and died within it, the corridors were arteries, and the machinery its beating heart. Amid the grinding chaos, the citizens of Hive Primus carried their own burdens, invisible yet no less oppressive. Laborers with soot-blackened faces dragged heavy carts along slippery floors, their hands blistered, their spines aching under loads that would have broken a lesser mortal. Children, rarely more than shadows themselves, dodged between crates and scaffolding, their small voices swallowed by the roar of pumps and fans. Women in patched uniforms carried data slates as carefully as if they were sacred relics, noting minute shifts in chemical readings, machinery performance, or bureaucratic directives. Each of them knew that a single misstep could summon the wrath of the Adeptus Arbites, or worse, the silent, omnipresent gaze of a wandering Skitarii patrol. There was no room for hesitation. Hesitation could cost a life. In the narrow veins of the Underhive, a different rhythm persisted. Here, light was a rumor, flickering through cracked lens shields and damaged vox grills. Shadows clung like a living organism, sliding across walls, pooling in corners where the footfalls of the unwary could awaken them. The faint smell of burned circuitry mixed with the tang of rust, acrid and bitter, while water dripped from unseen conduits, hissing as it fell into shallow puddles that reflected broken neon like shards of a shattered mirror. Every corner held a story, every corridor a secret. Some whispered through the hiss of pneumatic doors, others moaned in the creak of the steel scaffolding overhead. The Underhive was alive, and it had learned patience. Astra Militarum patrols moved through these corridors with deliberate slowness, boots splashing through the contaminated water, lost guns held ready, eyes scanning every shadow. Each soldier knew the hazards were not only mechanical. Rumors of rogue servitors, of heretical cults that had taken root in forgotten levels, and of the creatures that scuttled in the dark corners of forgotten sublevels kept even the most disciplined veteran alert. Whispers of orc scavengers sighted at the edges of the hive's lower reaches made them tighten their grips, hearts hammering against flak armor. The patrol passed through a particularly narrow sector of the Underhive, walls slick with grime, the echo of their movements magnified tenfold. Every clank of armor, every exhale of breath, could betray them. In one shadowed alcove, a laborer paused, rubbing a hand across his face. His name was Halric, a man of middling height and wiry build, whose eyes had learned to measure the weight of every shadow and calculate the risks of each step. Halric had been born in the Underhive, and he knew its rhythms as well as he knew his own pulse. Yet even he felt the subtle unease that had been spreading through the lower levels over the past cycles. Small disruptions, slight delays in machinery, sudden malfunctions, each insignificant in isolation, but together they spoke of a hive on edge, of a life that could be upended in the blink of a cogitator's eye. He knew he could not afford distraction. In Hive Primus, distraction was the first step toward oblivion. Above him, the muffled clang of a servitor's task was suddenly joined by a harsher sound, the scream of snapping metal. Halric froze, listening. Something had shifted, something that did not belong to the usual symphony of industrial groans. He adjusted the strap of his worn-out pack and pressed himself against the wall, eyes darting toward the source of the sound. In the dim glow of a flickering lumen sphere, he caught a glimpse of motion, a shadow that moved independently of the machinery, a shape that paused, observed, and then vanished as silently as it appeared. The hive had eyes, it always had. Some were mechanical, others were human, and a few were something else entirely. The corridor ahead seemed to constrict as if the walls themselves had grown impatient. Every step Halric took was measured, deliberate. He smelled the coppery tang of blood, though no wound was visible, and he could feel the vibration of distant engines through the soles of his boots. The air was suffocating, thick with tension. Somewhere in the shadows, life clung desperately to the edges of comprehension, and he felt the subtle, gnawing certainty that the Underhive had more secrets than any mortal could ever uncover. And yet, in the quiet moments between hisses of vent lines and the low hum of distant machinery, he felt the pulse of the hive beneath his feet, a living thing that would endure long after every citizen had turned to dust. Halric exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move forward. The shadows would watch. The hive would judge. Survival, he reminded himself, was not about courage. It was about knowing the rhythm of the world around you and moving in perfect time. Every breath, every step, every glance counted. And in Hive Primus, nothing was ever wasted. The further Halric descended into the Underhive, the more the corridors seemed to close around him, bending and folding like the coils of some immense, living serpent. Each step echoed through the narrow passageways, not just against steel walls but through layers of history. Here, in this warren of iron and soot, generations of laborers had built lives measured in the rhythm of machinery, in the whispered prayers to the Emperor, in the careful avoidance of Arbite's attention. Dust from centuries past clung to the air, settling over surfaces with a ghostly patience, and Halric could feel it coating his lungs with every inhale, each breath a reminder that he was both a part of this place and entirely at its mercy. In the distance, the faint, high-pitched whine of a servomotor signaled activity in a nearby manufactorum. Sparks flew intermittently from a welding arm, its glow throwing jagged shadows that danced across the walls. Halric's eyes adjusted, noting every nuance, a cracked panel, a dripping conduit, the glint of something that could be either a tool or a weapon. He knew that, in the Underhive, nothing was ever quite what it seemed. Shadows could conceal allies, enemies, or just the hive's indifferent machinery, but one could never tell until it was too late. The lesson had been learned by many before him, and repeated in countless whispered warnings. Look carefully, act deliberately, and trust nothing that breathes in the darkness without first verifying it. Halric paused at a junction where two corridors met at a sharp angle. The faint smell of burned promethium lingered here, stronger than elsewhere, searing the back of his throat. He could hear faint murmurs, a voice or perhaps the static whine of a damaged vox grill, so faint he could not be sure. He held his breath and pressed his back against the wall, counting the seconds as though each tick of time were a heartbeat in a greater organism. And then, just as he allowed himself a moment of reprieve, the noise grew sharper, almost deliberate. Something, or someone, was moving in the shadows, and Halric's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the short combat blade he always carried hidden beneath his coat. From the darkness emerged a figure, hunched, cloaked in grime and ragged layers of fabric that smelled of oil and decay. Eyes glimmered in the dim light, reflecting a mind sharpened by the constant threat of death. It was a scavenger, no doubt, one of the many who eked out survival by pilfering machinery parts, data slates, and anything else of value from the Hive's veins. Halric's pulse quickened, but he did not strike. The scavenger's movements were careful, calculated, and in that moment, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them, two mortals navigating a world that would consume either without hesitation. A sudden tremor ran through the floor beneath them, faint at first but growing rapidly into a low, rolling vibration. Machinery groaned above, somewhere in the manufacturum layers, and Halric felt the unmistakable resonance of metal stressed beyond its limit. A distant explosion echoed through the Underhive, followed by the sharp hiss of venting promethium and the panic-stricken shouts of workers reacting to a sudden collapse. Dust fell from the ceiling like snow, coating the corridor and turning familiar surfaces into deceptive hazards. Halric and the scavenger exchanged a brief glance, both aware that the Underhive could not forgive mistakes, that one misstep could mean being buried alive beneath tons of steel and ash. The corridors twisted unpredictably, forcing Halric to adapt to every change in pitch, angle, and texture. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots, a pulse of tension transmitted from the Hive itself, as though it were aware of his every movement. He moved with a precision born of necessity, avoiding puddles of acidic runoff that hissed against metal, skirting twisted cables that threatened to snag and pull him off balance. Shadows loomed coiled, and shifted with a life of their own, but he kept his gaze steady, training every sense to detect anomaly, movement, or threat. In the Underhive, perception was survival, and hesitation was death. Finally, he reached a junction leading deeper into the Hive's lower tiers, where the corridors narrowed, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt oil and human sweat. The glow from overhead lumen spheres flickered violently, casting the walls into alternating swaths of darkness and light. Halric stepped cautiously into the illuminated patches, every muscle coiled, every nerve attuned. Here, he realized with a cold certainty, the Hive had begun to assert itself with greater intensity, machinery failing, lights flickering, echoes carrying the scent of panic. Life here was a fragile balance between order and chaos, and it was only a matter of time before one misstep sent it tumbling into irrevocable disorder. Halric's eyes swept the corridor one last time before he moved forward, guided by intuition, experience, and the faint pulse of the Hive beneath him. Every step was deliberate, measured, a testament to the countless generations who had survived here before him. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the Hive observed, patient and indifferent, waiting for the moment when the next story would be written in blood, sweat, and steel. Halric pressed forward, the narrow corridors of the Underhive closing around him like the ribs of some colossal beast. The walls were slick with grime, and every step echoed faintly, magnified tenfold in the oppressive stillness that followed the distant tremor. The explosion from above had shifted something, a subtle rearrangement in the Hive's rhythm that set nerves on edge. Servitors paused mid-task, their mechanical heads swiveling with the precision of a predator, scanning, processing, judging. Even the flickering lumen spheres seemed to hesitate, casting shadows that wavered unnaturally, as though the very light had grown cautious. Halric's pulse was steady, trained over decades of survival, yet he could feel the Hive's tension vibrating through him, a reminder that he was only a single pulse in an organism far larger, far more patient, and infinitely more unforgiving. The scavenger had vanished as silently as it appeared, slipping into the shadows with a grace born of necessity. Halric acknowledged its absence with a silent nod. Encounters in the Underhive were rarely predictable, alliances formed and dissolved within breaths. It was not treachery that defined these relationships, but the relentless calculus of survival. Every human, every servitor, every creature had to balance risk against reward, and the margin for error was microscopic. Halric's eyes flicked to the edges of the corridor, noting subtle anomalies, a panel slightly ajar, sparks dancing across a conduit, the faint hum of machinery working in overdrive. Each was a potential hazard, a potential lifeline, or both. He reached a junction where the corridor split into 3 paths, each one twisting deeper into the hive's underbelly. The air here was almost tangible, thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and decay, and Halric breathed deliberately, forcing himself to remain calm. His mind catalogued each sensory detail: the vibration beneath his boots, the irregular flicker of a damaged lumen sphere, the faint scrape of metal against metal somewhere far beyond his sight. The hive spoke in these subtle cues, a language of instability and motion, and Halric had learned to listen. One wrong interpretation, one hesitation, could send him tumbling into the maw of disaster. He chose the leftmost path, the corridor narrowing further and plunging into darkness broken only by intermittent sparks from damaged conduits. The walls here were scarred, etched with decades of graffiti, prayer symbols, and warnings scratched into metal by hands long since turned to dust. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of discarded data slates, scorched or broken, their silent testimony to the lives that had been lost or condemned to this shadowed existence. The hive remembered, even if its citizens did not. It held the weight of every life, every failure, every act of desperation, and it pressed that memory into the consciousness of those who dared to traverse it. A sudden clatter drew Halric's attention. He froze, scanning the darkness. A rat, mechanically augmented, a grotesque fusion of flesh and metal, scuttled across the floor, its red eyes glowing in the faint light. It paused, sniffed the air, and then vanished down a side conduit, leaving Halric with the lingering impression that he had been observed. In the Underhive, nothing moved without purpose. The distinction between life and machinery, instinct and design, was often impossible to discern. Every encounter demanded vigilance, every shadow a potential threat. As he advanced, Halric glimpsed a faint, flickering glow at the end of the corridor. It was the telltale light of a manufactorum working in overdrive, the fire and sparks reflecting the hive's endless hunger for production. From this distance, the machinery appeared almost alive, each piston and gear a beating heart of steel. Workers moved in precise, painful rhythm, carrying out tasks that seemed simultaneously insignificant and vital. Halric felt the oppressive weight of the hive above and below him, a living testament to the Imperium's unyielding demand for productivity and obedience. Here, in these shadowed veins, survival was not merely a matter of breath or blood. It was a question of understanding the intricate dance of steel and flesh, fear and routine, observation and instinct. The corridor opened into a wider chamber, a junction where multiple levels of the hive intersected. Steam hissed from broken conduits, and the air shimmered with heat and chemical fumes. Halric's senses were at their limit, every nerve straining to decode the constant barrage of stimuli. He took a careful step forward, feeling the subtle tremor of the structure beneath him, a vibration that spoke of both fragility and latent power. Somewhere, far above, the Astra Militarum patrol continued its rounds, unaware of the silent tension building deep within the hive. Halric exhaled sharply, bracing himself. The Underhive had made its presence known, and he knew the next few cycles would test everything he had learned about survival, perception, and the rhythm of life in Hive Primus. And so, with the pulse of the hive beneath his boots and the shadows pressing in from all sides, Halric moved onward. Every step was measured, deliberate, and filled with the quiet acknowledgement that in this world, one miscalculation could mean oblivion. The corridors stretched ahead, dark and unyielding, whispering of trials yet to come. Somewhere deep in the twisting labyrinth, fire, fear, and the fragile pulse of human endurance waited. And Halric, as always, would have to meet them head-on, attuned to the rhythm of steel and shadows. The fire began as a whisper, a distant hiss of overtaxed machinery, almost lost beneath the constant roar of the hive. But whispers in Hive Primus rarely remained quiet for long. Halric felt the subtle tremor through the soles of his boots before he smelled it, the acrid tang of promethium burning where it should not, a chemical scream that set his nerves alight. He adjusted the strap of his pack and moved with practiced caution, instincts honed over years in corridors that had more teeth than compassion. Somewhere deeper in the manufactorum, a conduit had burst, igniting a pool of fuel. Sparks jumped along corroded metal, feeding the hungry glow that began to lick at the edges of the shadows. The workers were already reacting, though panic here was a careful choreography rather than chaos. Laborers shouted over the roar of escaping steam, data slates held aloft as they attempted to direct the flow of people away from the impending conflagration. Servitors skittered across the floor, their metal limbs clanging against the decking as they hauled crates and extinguishers, following the silent, pre-programmed logic that guided them. Halric moved among them, ducking beneath low-hanging cables and stepping over the occasional fallen worker, sensing with each heartbeat how the hive itself seemed to respond to the crisis. The walls groaned, the floor vibrated, and shadows twisted in strange, anxious patterns. It was as if the hive were holding its breath. The fire spread with a will of its own, feeding on waste oil, loose wiring, and flammable machinery. Flames hungrily licked the edges of catwalks, turning the dim corridors into rivers of light and heat. Workers' voices were sharp, carrying over the mechanical cacophony, each syllable laden with urgency. Halric's lungs burned with smoke, but he pressed on, aware that hesitation could be fatal. Every twist in the corridor presented a new hazard: weakened girders, puddles of acid, and the occasional shard of molten metal bouncing unpredictably. He glanced briefly at a data slate abandoned on the floor. Its readouts blinked erratically, warning of structural instability. Another tremor ran through the floor. Above him, somewhere in the tiered levels of the hive, a vox grill screeched a series of alarms. The metallic wails interlaced with human screams, an eerie symphony that the hive had orchestrated itself. Halric moved toward the source of the disturbance, guided not by sight but by the instinctive understanding that these disasters always followed a pattern. In the Underhive, a fire was never random. It was a message, a test, a prelude to the revelation of both human weakness and structural flaw. Workers moved like shadows among shadows, their sweat and soot merging into one, breathing heat and fear in equal measure. In a corner, Halric caught sight of a small group of laborers trapped behind a collapsed beam. Their shouts were muffled, half swallowed by smoke and steel, but their eyes reflected the firelight with raw, unfiltered panic. He pushed toward them, every step calculated to avoid drawing attention from the unstable girders overhead. With a strength born of necessity, he levered the beam just enough to allow one worker to crawl free. Another followed, and then the third, each gasping and coughing, their faces blackened with soot, yet alive. For a brief moment, Halric allowed himself the small satisfaction of survival, knowing the hive's watchful presence had not yet claimed him. But the fire was not yet finished. Sparks leapt from a damaged conduit, igniting a hanging cable that sizzled as it fell, releasing a cascade of molten metal. Halric shielded the rescued workers with his coat, feeling the heat sear the fabric and his own skin. Around him, the manufactorum twisted in a violent dance, girders buckling, steam hissing, machinery screaming. And yet, even in the chaos, the hive's rhythm persisted, each tremor, each flash of flame, a reminder of the delicate balance that kept millions alive. One misstep, one miscalculation, and the balance would shatter. Through the haze, Halric glimpsed figures in the upper tiers, Adeptus Arbites observers, their armor gleaming faintly beneath streaks of smoke. They moved with mechanical certainty, assessing, recording, enforcing the laws that mortals both revered and feared. Their presence was a reminder that, while the fire raged, the Imperium watched, indifferent to individual suffering. Survival, Halric realized, was not just a matter of dodging flames. It was about understanding the hierarchy of power, both human and mechanical, and maneuvering within it. As he guided the last trapped worker toward a safer corridor, the Underhive responded in ways subtle and terrifying. Pipes shuddered, and a low moan resonated through the walls. It was unclear if the sound came from the stressed infrastructure, the machinery, or some deeper, more sentient pulse beneath the hive. Halric pressed on, lungs burning, senses stretched to their limit, aware that the fire was only the beginning. Every corridor he navigated carried the potential for further disaster, for confrontation, for revelation. In Hive Primus, danger was never a single event, it was a constant, living presence, and those who survived learned not to fight it directly but to move in harmony with it, to anticipate it, and to respect it. Halric moved deeper into the manufactorum, where the fire's orange glow danced along walls scarred with decades of soot and burn marks. Heat pressed against him, suffocating and thick, carrying with it the scent of molten metal, charred flesh, and chemical fumes. His lungs worked furiously, pulling in air that was half smoke, half despair. Yet instinct, honed by years in Hive Primus, kept him steady. He stepped over puddles of viscous, blackened liquid that hissed and spat, careful to avoid the shallow yet lethal currents of acid. The corridors twisted unpredictably, forcing him to anticipate every change in elevation, every hanging cable, every loose plate that could shift under his weight. The hive demanded attention, and it tolerated no mistake. Voices echoed through the smoke, some human, some mechanical, but all laced with the unmistakable strain of fear. Workers directed each other with clipped shouts, gesturing toward exits that were themselves uncertain. Sparks from ruptured conduits danced across steel surfaces, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. Halric's hand brushed against the cold surface of a fallen pipe, noting the way the heat radiated from nearby flames, a warning as precise as any data slate could provide. The fire was alive in its own right, and it spread with intent, testing the resolve, skill, and endurance of those caught in its path. From above, the distant clang of falling girders added a new rhythm to the chaos, a drumbeat of structural stress that vibrated through the floor. Halric paused at a junction, sensing the pressure building both in the air and in the minds of those around him. A servitor skittered past, its mechanical limbs moving with urgent precision, carrying extinguishing foam toward a smaller flare that threatened to engulf a stack of volatile materials. Halric felt the pulse of the hive beneath him as clearly as if it were his own heartbeat, an omnipresent awareness that these corridors were more than just metal. They were an organism, reactive and unforgiving. He found another group of workers pinned behind a collapsed catwalk, their faces streaked with soot and tears. Some trembled visibly, others stared blankly, as though the fire had already consumed part of their consciousness. Halric approached, voice low but firm, guiding them with precise gestures through a path where the heat was less intense, where the smoke thinned just enough to draw a breath without choking. One young worker, coughing violently, clung to his sleeve, the data slate in his hands trembling as if it too feared destruction. "Keep moving," Halric urged, though his words were swallowed almost instantly by the roar of fire and collapsing metal. Suddenly, a series of sparks arced across a damaged conduit overhead, igniting a thin layer of flammable oil on the floor. Halric reacted instinctively, dropping to one knee and pushing the nearest worker out of immediate danger. The flames hissed, licking at their feet, and for a moment it seemed the corridor would collapse into unmanageable chaos. But Halric's knowledge of the hive's geometry allowed him to navigate through a narrow gap, leading the group into a smaller chamber where the smoke was less thick, where the air seemed marginally cooler. Here, amid the rattling walls and the distant screams of the manufactorum, the temporary calm allowed a flicker of realization. Survival was not chance. It was understanding the environment, predicting its reaction, and moving with a rhythm dictated not by human will, but by the pulse of the hive itself. In the chamber, Halric allowed himself a brief glance upward, toward the upper tiers where the Arbites and higher-ranking overseers would observe from their elevated perches. Their presence was a constant reminder that even in disaster, there was scrutiny, a system of judgment that extended beyond immediate survival. The fire, the tremors, the collapsing structures, all of it would be catalogued, analyzed, and judged. Individual lives mattered, but only in the context of the larger machine. Halric's shoulders stiffened at the thought, but he let it pass, focusing on the group before him. They were alive, and that was the first victory. A faint hiss drew his attention again. Another conduit had ruptured in the next chamber, sending sparks arcing along a puddle of oil. Halric gritted his teeth, noting the reactive patterns, the subtle cues that the hive offered to those who would listen. Each hiss, each vibration, each groan of stressed metal was a line of communication. The fire was not merely destruction, it was instruction, warning, and test all at once. As he led the workers through the new hazard, he realized with a cold clarity that the hive's dangers were relentless, escalating, and interconnected. Surviving one challenge was never enough. The next was always closer, always hungering for attention, always demanding respect. And yet, in that infernal dance of fire, smoke, and collapsing steel, Halric felt something he could not name. A pulse beneath the pulse, a rhythm that transcended the immediate danger. The hive's machinery, the heat, the flames, they were all parts of a greater organism, vast and ancient, its memory embedded in every weld, every bolt, every layer of rusted metal. To survive, he had to move not just with awareness, but with understanding, syncing with a cadence far larger than his own heartbeat. In the depths of Hive Primus, that understanding was the only weapon that could protect the living from being swallowed entirely by the shadows. The fire had begun to settle into its own rhythm, crackling and hissing in uneven bursts, feeding on wreckage and debris while casting long, leaping shadows across the walls. Halric led the small group of survivors through a series of twisting corridors that narrowed sharply at times, forcing them to move single file. The heat pressed from all sides, a living weight that seemed to anticipate their every motion. Sweat stung their eyes and smoke clawed at their lungs, but they pressed on, guided by Halric's calm voice and unwavering steps. In this part of the hive, fear was a constant companion, but it had to be managed with discipline and attentiveness. Panic would guarantee death faster than any flame. Ahead, a door had been partially warped by the heat, its metal curling and groaning under stress. Halric reached for it, testing its edges carefully with gloved hands. Sparks danced along the seam, and a faint trickle of smoke escaped from its warped frame. He glanced back at the workers, noting the hesitation in their posture. "Follow my lead," he said, voice steady, though his teeth clenched against the acrid taste of smoke. Pushing gently, he leveraged his strength, forcing the door open just enough to allow passage. The chamber beyond was slightly cooler, a space where the heat of the main fire had yet to reach fully, and for the briefest moment, the survivors felt a flicker of relief. But relief in Hive Primus was always temporary. The ceiling trembled subtly, a low-frequency groan that spoke of metal stressed beyond endurance. Pipes overhead hissed, releasing scalding steam in violent bursts. The survivors instinctively pressed against the walls, ducking beneath low-hanging conduits, their eyes darting to the shifting shadows. Halric moved with them, every step deliberate, every glance calculating the hive's hidden hazards. Even as the fire raged behind them, the more insidious dangers of collapsing infrastructure, boiling steam, and failing conduits demanded attention. Life here was a series of calculated movements, each one a gamble against forces far larger and more indifferent than mortal comprehension. Through the haze, Halric noticed the faint outline of a figure slumped near the far wall. A worker, unconscious or perhaps overcome by smoke, blocked the narrow passage. He moved swiftly, assessing the risk of approaching the figure amid the unstable debris. A sparking cable dangled dangerously above, and a shard of twisted metal jutted sharply from the floor. Carefully, he lifted the figure, feeling the familiar burn of exertion through his arms as he guided them to safety. The worker coughed violently upon inhaling fresher air, eyes wide with terror yet alive. Halric gave a curt nod. Each life saved was a minor victory, but in the hive, victory was measured in moments, not triumphs. As they pressed onward, the Underhive revealed another layer of its complexity. Faint murmurs and whispered prayers echoed from side corridors, carrying the scent of incense and sanctified oil, a reminder that even amid mechanical chaos, faith persisted. Workers crossed themselves with trembling hands, whispering fragments of liturgy to the Emperor, seeking protection from an all-seeing presence whose will was often inscrutable. Halric acknowledged these gestures silently, aware that the Emperor's light, however distant, remained a guiding force. It did not offer protection in a tangible sense, but it lent clarity, purpose, and discipline to those navigating the hive's endless hazards. The corridors finally widened into a more open chamber, its ceiling high above, pipes crisscrossing overhead like veins carrying the lifeblood of Hive Primus. The fire still raged in the distance, throwing heat and light unevenly, but here the air was marginally cooler, allowing the survivors to regain some semblance of composure. Halric exhaled sharply, taking stock. His lungs burned, his muscles ached, but the pulse of the hive beneath him remained steady. He could feel the tremor of distant machinery, the subtle vibrations that hinted at instability elsewhere. The fire had altered the rhythm of the hive, but it had not claimed them, yet. Even as he allowed himself this fleeting assessment, Halric's instincts warned him that the crisis was not yet over. The fire was only the beginning, a test of awareness, agility, and understanding of the hive's labyrinthine structure. The corridors ahead, darker and more complex, would demand even more precision. Every sound, every vibration, every flicker of light could signal hazard or opportunity. Survival depended on reading these signals, moving in harmony with the hive's unpredictable pulse, and understanding that in this living, breathing organism, danger was omnipresent, patient, and unyielding. And so, with the last embers of fear mingling with the smoke and sweat, Halric led the group onward, deeper into Hive Primus, toward shadows that held not just fire, but the murmurs of rumor, the weight of unseen eyes, and the first faint stirrings of forces beyond immediate comprehension. Each step carried them closer to not only the physical dangers of the Underhive, but the whispering pulse of the Astronomican itself, faint and distant, yet never absent, guiding, warning, and observing. The deeper Halric descended into the Underhive, the more the corridors seemed to pulse with a rhythm beyond his own heartbeat. The fire had left its mark, scorched walls, warped metal, and the lingering scent of smoke and promethium. Yet now, amid the settling debris, another presence made itself felt. It was subtler than flames or tremors, almost imperceptible to the untrained senses, but it was there, a faint hum in the air, a vibration that threaded through metal and bone alike. Workers whispered of it as the Emperor's pulse, a trace of the Astronomican filtering down even to the hive's lowest reaches. Some said it was a blessing, others a warning, but to those who listened carefully, it offered guidance, an invisible hand shaping decisions and movement. Halric felt it in his chest, a tingling warmth that seemed to align with his every breath. He had heard such tales before, murmured by old scribes and psychers assigned to the lower tiers, always cautious, always tentative. No one dared claim certainty about what they felt, because certainty in Hive Primus was an invitation to ruin. The pulse was unreliable, sometimes absent, sometimes overwhelming, shifting with the complex interplay of machinery, human thought, and perhaps forces beyond comprehension. As Halric moved, he noticed that his steps coincided with faint shifts in vibration, an alignment that allowed him to avoid unstable flooring, loose piping, and sections of wall ready to collapse. Whether this was instinct, luck, or the touch of the Astronomican, he could not say. In the narrow junctions, data slates flickered with imperfect readings. Chemical outputs, machinery stress sensors, and emergency heat warnings all conflicted with each other, creating an incoherent map of hazard and safety. Workers consulted them nervously, then quickly abandoned them, trusting instead in intuition sharpened by years of navigating the Underhive. Halric, too, relied on this balance between tangible data and intangible sense. The pulse in the air, soft, almost melodic beneath the groan of steel and the hiss of vents, offered cues that no device could replicate. It hinted at spaces of safety, concealed dangers, and potential allies hidden in the shadowed alleys of Hive Primus. Through a dim corridor, Halric glimpsed a figure kneeling in reverence before a small shrine crudely etched into a steel wall. The sigil of the Imperial Aquila had been painstakingly inscribed and adorned with fragments of blessed oil and scorched incense. The figure muttered prayers in a hushed cadence, eyes closed, lips moving so swiftly that Halric could barely follow the rhythm. The worker's devotion was quiet but fervent, a solitary act of faith amid the mechanical chaos of the hive. Halric did not interrupt. He had long learned that in Hive Primus, the faintest acts of faith often carried a protective weight as potent as any lost gun or blade. Yet the pulse of the Astronomican was not limited to devotional spaces. In the twisting corridors, faint, ethereal flickers of light appeared, reflecting off polished metal, sometimes catching the eye of an observant worker and drawing a whispered gasp. Some claimed they saw figures, fragments of the Emperor's will, drifting in reflection or shadow, guiding actions or observing failures. Halric did not allow himself to be distracted, though the effect was undeniable. Even the most rational mind could feel the tug, the subtle insistence that choices carried weight beyond immediate survival, that the hive itself was intertwined with something larger, distant, and incomprehensibly vast. As he navigated further, Halric noticed that machinery seemed to respond to the rhythm of this presence. Pistons slowed their irregular stuttering, valves hissed more evenly, and the faint vibration beneath his boots steadied. It was as if the pulse of the Astronomican resonated not only in human perception, but in the hive's vast network of gears, conduits, and hydraulic limbs. Observers in higher tiers, if they were watching, would have attributed it to mechanical realignment or latent resonance, but those on the ground understood differently. There was something guiding them, subtle and unseen, threading hope and caution together in ways they could not fully articulate. And yet, this ethereal influence was as unpredictable as it was powerful. Halric felt the pulse recede suddenly in one corridor, leaving him disoriented, forcing him to rely on sight, sound, and memory alone. In another passage, it surged faintly, just enough to guide him past the collapsed stairwell and toward a safer path. Every fluctuation carried a lesson: trust, but verify, move deliberately, observe closely, respect forces beyond mortal understanding. Survival in the Underhive was no longer purely a matter of navigating fire, collapse, or steel. Now it demanded awareness of currents both tangible and spiritual, threads woven invisibly into the corridors he had known since birth. Halric advanced cautiously, every footstep measured against the subtle vibrations and flickers that indicated both danger and guidance. The Underhive was alive, not only in its grinding machinery and twisting corridors, but in the intangible pulse that threaded through every girder, conduit, and ventilation shaft. He felt it again, a gentle resonance that seemed to align with his movements, guiding him past fractured floors, sparking conduits, and rusted catwalks that threatened collapse. It was as if the hive itself had learned to respond to perception, bending the chaotic elements to the rhythm of those attuned enough to sense it. Workers clustered in small groups along the way, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, eyes darting to shadows that might conceal hazards, or worse. Some whispered prayers beneath their breath, eyes fixed on the faintest signs of guidance offered by the pulse. Others murmured rumors, fragments of stories about strange apparitions, fleeting shapes glimpsed in reflections of molten metal, or in the wavering light of flickering lumen spheres. "The Emperor watches," one muttered, voice low and reverent. "Even down here, even in the darkest veins." Such words, though spoken softly, carried weight. In Hive Primus, rumor was a tool as sharp as any blade, a form of guidance when logic failed. The corridors twisted sharply, forcing Halric to adjust his pace. Shadows deepened unnaturally here, flickering in time with the faint vibrations beneath the floor. He noted the slight warping of metal walls and the occasional drip of water onto heated conduits, each a subtle hazard demanding attention. The pulse grew stronger in one section, guiding him through a partially collapsed sector where dozens of rusted pipes and twisted girders could have spelled disaster for any unwary traveler. He led the workers through it with care, feeling the pulse recede once they were clear, leaving an echoing stillness that was both comforting and ominous. In a junction lit only by the scattered glow of emergency lamps, Halric paused, sensing the faintest flicker of movement in the shadows. A figure emerged, an older laborer, robes tattered and patched, eyes reflecting the distant glow of machinery, carrying a data slate that seemed far too delicate for the environment. The man's presence was quiet but insistent, a kind of authority born not of rank but of survival and experience. He spoke without preamble, voice low yet carrying across the corridor. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, eyes scanning the ceiling and walls. Halric inclined his head, understanding instantly. The pulse of the Astronomican, a faint, guiding resonance, threading through the corridors like a hidden river, shaping decisions and movements of those sensitive enough to perceive it. The laborer gestured toward a narrower passage, half obscured by shadows and debris. "It guides us sometimes. Not always, but when it does, heed it." He paused, glancing over the survivors behind Halric. "And never mistake absence for safety. The hive tests patience, perception, and faith alike." Halric absorbed the warning silently, recognizing it as a lesson forged in countless cycles of hazard and survival. Here, the boundaries between rumor, intuition, and reality blurred. Faith and perception were intertwined, and every action carried consequences beyond immediate comprehension. The corridors began to descend, spiraling gradually downward into deeper, darker layers of the Underhive. Here, the pulse was erratic, fluctuating with subtle shifts in machinery and ventilation, rising faintly in resonance only to vanish a heartbeat later. Halric adjusted his movements accordingly, relying on sight, touch, and the faint guidance threading through his consciousness. The survivors followed in his wake, tense but trusting, aware that each step forward was both progress and risk. The Underhive demanded constant adaptation. One misstep, one misread vibration, and the consequences could be fatal. Even as Halric moved, he remained aware of the psychological weight pressing on those around him. The whispers of the Astronomican, the distant hum of machinery, and the lingering rumors of shadowed figures all layered upon one another, creating a tapestry of tension, faith, and uncertainty. The survivors' attention shifted constantly between hazard and guidance, between instinct and whispered rumor, and Halric felt the pressure of responsibility. Each choice carried not only immediate risk but the weight of understanding a pulse that was larger than any single mind, a rhythm both protective and indifferent, shaping the flow of life within Hive Primus. The descent into the lower tiers of the Underhive revealed corridors that seemed older, more fractured, and strangely reverent, as if the very walls remembered centuries of devotion, labor, and despair. Halric felt the pulse of the Astronomican fluctuate, subtle yet insistent, guiding him past patches of weakened flooring, precarious catwalks, and machinery groaning under its own weight. Each vibration beneath his boots carried meaning, teaching him the rhythm of the hive in ways no data slate or sensor could capture. Here, survival was a mixture of perception, experience, and trust in the currents of forces both tangible and unseen. A flickering lumen sphere illuminated a small alcove where a makeshift shrine had been set up, crude yet meticulously maintained. Scorched fragments of blessed incense and faded sigils marked it as a space for prayer and reflection. A young worker knelt there, hands folded over the imperial aquila, muttering prayers that were nearly swallowed by the hiss of escaping steam. Halric moved silently past, aware that faith was as much a shield here as steel or weaponry. In Hive Primus, even the faintest acts of devotion carried weight, sometimes guiding perception, sometimes offering solace in an environment defined by chaos and danger. As they navigated further, Halric noticed subtle shifts in the hive's mechanical systems. Pistons that had stuttered in previous corridors now operated in smoother, more predictable rhythms. Sparks arced less frequently along conduits, and the faint vibrations beneath his feet seemed to pulse in cadence with the whispers of the Astronomican. It was as if the hive itself had begun to respond, not to physical force, but to alignment with something greater, something unseen, shaping paths, creating spaces where survival was momentarily more attainable. Yet Halric knew better than to assume permanence. The Underhive's mercy was fickle, fleeting, and always contingent. A distant clang echoed through the tunnels, abrupt and metallic, pulling Halric's attention to a narrower corridor branching off to the side. Shadows pooled there, unnaturally dark despite the glow of overhead lumen spheres. From within emerged a figure, wrapped in layers of grime and patched robes, carrying a short-range vox grill. Its presence was deliberate, measured, and Halric sensed the unspoken caution. This was a survivor like himself, attuned to the hive's rhythm, testing the boundaries of trust. The figure nodded briefly, voice muffled beneath a respirator, conveying acknowledgement of shared perception rather than words. In Hive Primus, connection was sparse, and every nod, every glance, carried meaning heavier than any statement. The corridors widened again, opening into a chamber that stretched high above, intersected with crisscrossing pipes, conduits, and platforms. Halric felt the pulse intensify here, the vibrations threading through metal and concrete like an unseen current. Some workers paused instinctively, listening, sensing that something, whether hazard or guidance, was imminent. He guided them carefully through the chamber, noting every tremor, every hiss of steam, every shadow that flickered with ambiguous intent. Even as physical danger persisted, the weight of perception grew heavier. Choices now carried resonance beyond survival, touching threads of awareness that were as much spiritual as material. As they continued onward, the whispers of rumor grew louder. Stories of fragments of the emperor's will manifesting in reflective surfaces, of fleeting shadows guiding, or misguiding, those attuned to the pulse, circulated quietly among the survivors. Halric had heard these tales before, but the deeper corridors of the Underhive seemed to validate them in subtle ways. The rhythm of footsteps, the alignment of sparks and light, the faint, almost musical vibrations that hinted at something beyond mortal comprehension. In this space, faith, perception, and experience intertwined, forming a lattice of survival that was both protective and exacting. The Underhive pressed in around them, corridors twisting into narrower, darker passages. Yet Halric felt a sense of cautious momentum. Each step was deliberate, each breath calculated, each glance scanning for both hazard and guidance. The pulse of the Astronomican, though faint and unpredictable, lent clarity amid chaos. The survivors trusted Halric not merely for his skill or strength, but for his ability to read this invisible thread, to interpret the subtle rhythms of Hive Primus, and to guide them through danger that was as much psychological and spiritual as it was physical. And so, with the pulse vibrating faintly beneath his feet and the whispers threading through the air, Halric led the group deeper into Hive Primus. Every corridor, every shadow, every flicker of light hinted at mysteries and perils yet to be revealed. The Underhive was no longer merely a labyrinth of steel, fire, and collapse. It was a living organism, interwoven with rumor, perception, and distant metaphysical resonance. The challenges ahead would not only test survival skills but perception, faith, and the delicate harmony required to navigate a space where every pulse, every whisper, carried weight far beyond immediate comprehension. The corridors grew narrower and more oppressive as Halric descended, the shadows pressing inward with a weight that seemed almost sentient. The pulse of the Astronomican persisted, a subtle vibration threading through metal, concrete, and bone alike, but here it felt strained, fragmented, as though the hive itself had begun to resist its own rhythm. The fire from the higher tiers had left scars, burned-out conduits, twisted beams, and pockets of residual heat, but it was the unseen currents of energy and perception that posed the greatest danger. Each step required careful calculation. Misreading the pulse could send them plummeting into a hidden fissure, or worse, draw the attention of scavenger gangs that thrived in these depths. Workers moved with quiet urgency behind Halric, their breaths ragged, eyes wide and alert. Some muttered prayers, others whispered rumors, fragments of lore passed down through decades of survival. They spoke of the hive's judgment, how it seemed to respond to the strength, awareness, and faith of those within it. Few knew whether it was literal or metaphorical, but in the depths, interpretation mattered less than action. Halric understood that the hive was indifferent yet exacting, rewarding careful attention and punishing even minor lapses. Survival required more than instinct. It demanded attunement to a living organism that spanned miles of steel, stone, and whispered rumor. A faint hiss echoed from a nearby vent, followed by a low rumble that resonated through the floor. Halric felt the vibration through his boots, subtle yet deliberate, guiding him away from a weakened support beam above a narrow pit. Sparks leapt unpredictably along a conduit, sending arcs of molten metal splashing across the walls. He moved with deliberate precision, signaling to the workers behind him to follow each step carefully. Their eyes tracked his movements, learning to synchronize with his understanding of the hive's rhythm, trusting him not simply as a guide but as an interpreter of a space that defied conventional logic. In a wider chamber ahead, the structural strain of the hive became evident. Catwalks groaned, stairwells shuddered, and mechanical arms hung suspended, twitching unpredictably. Amid the chaos, Halric noticed faint glimmers of light reflecting off metal surfaces. Some were natural, born of sparks and scorched conduits, but others seemed to flicker with a deliberate cadence, as though responding to the pulse of the Astronomican or some deeper, ineffable influence. Workers paused instinctively, hands pressed against walls or machinery, murmuring prayers that wove together desperation and hope. Halric moved among them with quiet authority, guiding through both hazard and uncertainty, aware that in Hive Primus, judgment often manifested in ways imperceptible yet undeniable. From the shadows, a figure emerged, an overseer of unknown origin, robes patched with the insignia of the Adeptus Arbites. Its presence was silent but heavy, eyes reflecting both calculation and warning. It surveyed the group, noting their alignment with the pulse, their careful movements, and their response to immediate danger. Halric instinctively understood that this observer was not merely cataloging events. It was assessing rhythm, discipline, and perception, the intangible qualities the Hive seemed to prize. The overseer gave a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of competence, before fading back into the shadows, leaving an echo of unease and respect. As they pressed onward, the corridors twisted downward, converging in a labyrinth of pipes, conduits, and forgotten machinery. The Hive's pulse grew erratic here, a mixture of resonance and interference that challenged even Halric's finely tuned senses. Sparks leapt from corroded wiring, the air thickened with fumes, and the distant hum of machinery seemed to echo in counterpoint to the faint whispers threading through perception. Rumors had long told of fragments of the Emperor's will manifesting in reflections, vibrations, or fleeting apparitions. Halric allowed himself no certainty, only observation and adaptation. The Underhive did not offer clarity. It demanded vigilance, patience, and the quiet attunement of senses honed through experience. The workers' confidence wavered under this subtle stress, but Halric's steady presence kept them aligned, moving in harmony with the Hive's shifting rhythm. He felt a surge of awareness, a fleeting clarity that revealed hidden hazards and possible routes through collapsed sectors. Every flicker of light, every shudder of the floor, every hiss of vented steam became part of a mosaic, a map that could mean life or death. In Hive Primus, judgment was never explicit. It was woven into the corridors, the machinery, and the pulse itself. To survive, one had to interpret it correctly, to act in accordance with a rhythm larger than oneself, larger than fear, larger even than fire or falling steel. And yet, beneath this tangible rhythm, there were subtler currents, the whispers of the Hive's own memory, echoes of past labor, failure, and endurance. Halric sensed them in faint vibrations, in shadows cast by flickering lumen spheres, in the barely perceptible alignment of machinery responding to unseen forces. These echoes did not dictate behavior, but they offered guidance to those attuned enough to perceive it. The Hive judged silently, impartially, and inexorably. Every decision, every movement, every act of awareness was measured, catalogued, and integrated into the ongoing rhythm of life and survival. The corridors became tighter, the ceiling lower, forcing Halric and the workers to move single file. The air was thick with dust, soot, and the faint metallic tang of stress-worn machinery. Sparks from ruptured conduits flickered intermittently, casting shadows that leapt along the walls, morphing ordinary shapes into monstrous silhouettes. The pulse of the Astronomican persisted faintly, threading through the chaos, but here it felt like a fragile beacon, fragile yet insistent, demanding focus. Halric adjusted his steps, aligning his movements to its rhythm, guiding the group with subtle gestures and whispered instructions, teaching them to sense not only danger but opportunity, to perceive patterns invisible to those less attuned. A sudden tremor ran through the floor, low and ominous, resonating in his chest. Pipes overhead groaned, dislodged panels rattled, and debris shifted along the edges of the corridor. Halric instinctively braced against the steel beam, feeling the vibrations ripple through his hands and arms. The group behind him followed suit, muscles tensing, every sense sharpened. In Hive Primus, even the smallest tremor could presage a collapse or trigger a cascade of failures. Each moment demanded precision, calm, and an intimate understanding of both the Hive and the faint guidance threading through the air. In a wider chamber, remnants of past industry lay scattered, broken servitors, discarded tools, and scorched crates, all mingling in a tableau of decay and memory. The pulse of the Astronomican intensified here, and Halric felt it as a subtle tug, directing attention to a partially collapsed stairwell. Through this narrow gap, a safer route unfolded, invisible to those unaccustomed to listening to the Hive's rhythm. He led the workers forward, mindful of every step. Sparks arced overhead, and faint smoke drifted along the walls, but each hazard seemed to harmonize with the pulse, offering warning in rhythm rather than chaos. A distant voice echoed from the shadows, muffled yet unmistakable. Another survivor, older and more attuned to the Underhive's peculiar patterns, emerged from a narrow passage. He gestured briefly, eyes flicking toward a collapsed conduit, then back toward Halric. Without words, the message was clear: trust the rhythm, observe the pulse, respect the Hive's judgment. The brief exchange carried weight beyond simple communication. In Hive Primus, gestures, glances, and small acts of recognition often conveyed more than spoken language. Survival relied not only on skill but on understanding these subtle cues. Halric felt the pulse fluctuate sharply as they moved deeper, guiding them past pockets of dangerous steam and unstable girders. The rhythm became more complex, layered with echoes of past labor, faint machinery vibrations, and whispers of rumor circulating through the corridors. Some workers murmured prayers, eyes fixed on flickering lumen spheres. Others followed silently, minds focused entirely on perceiving patterns in the shadows and vibrations. Halric maintained a delicate balance, interpreting the pulse and relaying guidance in the subtlest of ways, ensuring the group remained aligned with both tangible hazards and the unseen currents threading through Hive Primus. The Hive's judgment was impartial, silent, and constant. Sparks leapt unpredictably from corroded conduits, yet at times seemed to align almost perfectly with the path Halric had chosen. Machinery groaned, but never in a way that threatened immediate collapse. Shadows flickered, revealing hazards without overwhelming them. It was as if the Hive itself measured skill, attention, and attunement, responding not with mercy, but with patterns that rewarded awareness and punished neglect. Halric understood that this judgment was neither benevolent nor cruel, it simply was. And in following its rhythm, the group survived where others might have perished. Even as they pressed onward, the whispers grew more insistent. Workers spoke quietly of strange visions, of fleeting shapes in reflection or shadow, guiding, or misleading, those sensitive to the Hive's pulse. Halric did not claim certainty. Such things were rumor, perception, and faith interwoven, yet their effect was tangible. Choices now carried weight beyond immediate survival. They resonated with forces that, while unverifiable, shaped perception, action, and outcome. Each step required focus, intuition, and courage, a triad that defined existence within the Hive. Halric led the group through a narrow spiral stairwell, its metal steps worn smooth by centuries of countless feet. The air was thick, a heavy mixture of smoke, dust, and the faint tang of overheated machinery. The pulse of the Astronomican pulsed faintly beneath his feet, a subtle rhythm that guided movement through danger and obscured paths alike. Every vibration, every flicker of light, every hiss of vented steam became a line of communication, an instruction from the Hive itself. Here, survival required not just vigilance, but harmony with the hidden currents threading through steel, stone, and shadow. The walls seemed to close in as they descended, and faint echoes bounced through the spiral, layering voices, vibrations, and whispered prayers into a tapestry of perception. A worker muttered under her breath, repeating fragments of liturgy, while another adjusted a respirator, trying to clear the acrid smoke from his lungs. Halric felt the pulse strengthen in irregular surges, and instinctively slowed his pace, guiding the group past sections of weakened flooring and hanging conduits. The Hive's judgment was impartial, but precise. Failure to recognize the rhythm could result in injury or death, and the lesson would not be repeated. In a chamber below, a faint light reflected off twisted metal and machinery. Sparks arced along exposed conduits, but the pulse of the Astronomican highlighted a narrow path through the chaos, almost imperceptible to those untrained in its subtle cadence. Halric led the survivors along it, careful to avoid loose beams and puddles of corrosive liquid. The air vibrated faintly with echoes of past labor, ancient groans of long-dead machinery, and whispered fragments of warning carried through the centuries. Even as the immediate danger receded, the weight of history pressed down, a reminder that Hive Primus was not just a physical space but a living record of endurance, failure, and survival. From a shadowed alcove emerged another figure, cloaked in patched robes and carrying a short-range vox grill. Its presence was deliberate and silent, observing the group without approach. Halric instinctively acknowledged the observer, recognizing a shared attunement to the Hive's rhythm. In Hive Primus, such encounters were rare, those sensitive to the pulse often encountered one another not by chance but by the hive's subtle guidance. The figure inclined its head briefly, offering acknowledgement rather than instruction, then retreated into shadow. This quiet recognition reinforced the understanding that perception, alignment, and attunement to the hive's judgment were as vital as courage or strength. The corridors began to widen again, the ceiling higher, allowing glimpses of massive machinery and interlaced conduits stretching into darkness. Sparks still flew, metal groaned, and residual heat rose from collapsed sectors above, yet the pulse now hummed with a more consistent cadence. Halric noted the change, sensing a convergence of currents that suggested the group was nearing a point of transition, a threshold between immediate survival and the broader mysteries of the hive, where rumor, faith, and perception intertwined. The workers followed, breath ragged, eyes wide, but attuned to the rhythm guiding them. Even as they advanced, the whispers of rumor persisted, fragments of vision, fleeting shapes and reflective surfaces, and subtle alignments of sparks and shadows suggested the presence of forces beyond comprehension. Halric did not claim certainty, but he observed, interpreted, and guided. The hive's judgment was clear: survival depended on awareness, adaptability, and attunement to patterns larger than oneself. Every movement resonated with unseen consequences, every choice became a thread in the ongoing weave of perception, faith, and endurance. And so, Halric and the workers pressed onward, deeper into Hive Primus, moving towards spaces where fire, collapse, and machinery were only the beginning of the challenges. The pulse of the Astronomican, faint but persistent, threaded through every corridor and shadow, guiding and testing in equal measure. The hive's judgment was impartial, exacting, and eternal, and those attuned enough to perceive its rhythm could navigate its dangers, not merely surviving, but understanding their place within its vast, living organism. The threshold ahead promised new revelation, where the boundaries between hazard, rumor, and the faint whisper of the Emperor's will would blur, and perception would become as vital as strength or skill. The corridors of Hive Primus grew stranger as Halric pressed onward, the weight of centuries pressing down with every step. Shadows pooled unnaturally, thick and viscous, as if the very air had been tempered by eons of human toil, fire, and devotion. The pulse of the Astronomican persisted faintly, threading through steel and stone alike, but here it wavered, faltering in places and surging in others. It was no longer merely a guide through fire and collapse. It had become a presence, almost sentient, shaping perception and choice with subtle insistence. Halric could feel it resonating in the backs of his skull, in his chest, and the soles of his boots. Every nerve, every sense, became attuned to a rhythm far larger than himself, a cadence that blended danger, guidance, and whispering rumor into a single current of awareness. Workers followed closely behind, some silent, some murmuring prayers or fragments of liturgy, their voices swallowed by the ambient hum of machinery and the faint resonance of the Astronomican. Every step demanded vigilance. A tremor beneath a foot could signal impending collapse, a flicker of light could mark unstable conduits, and every shadow might conceal threats, human or otherwise. Yet these tangible dangers were now accompanied by subtler tests. Halric felt the pulse directing attention to corridors where reflections and flickering sparks aligned in ways that suggested patterns, warnings, or guidance. Rumors had long suggested that fragments of the Emperor's will, or the hive's own memory, manifested in these signs, but certainty was never attainable. Survival required faith in perception, and courage in interpretation. A narrow junction opened ahead, revealing a chamber littered with rusted machinery and collapsed scaffolding. Sparks danced along broken conduits, illuminating faces twisted with exhaustion, determination, and awe. Halric guided the group carefully through the debris, reading every vibration, every flicker, every micro-shift in metal. Here, the pulse surged, a faint musical quality threading through the chaos. Workers instinctively adjusted their pace, aligning with the rhythm, sensing hazards and safe steps alike. Halric knew that to misread even a single note could be catastrophic. The hive's judgment extended beyond immediate survival, weaving consequence into every decision, every movement, every breath. From the shadows, faint whispers emerged, almost imperceptible, like the resonance of distant machinery, yet carrying meaning for those attuned enough to hear. The workers murmured in recognition, speaking softly of visions glimpsed in reflective metal, of fleeting shapes guiding their steps, and of currents that seemed to anticipate hazard and opportunity alike. Halric accepted these whispers as part of the pulse, acknowledging that rumor, perception, and faint metaphysical resonance were now inseparable from navigation and survival. The Hive, in its infinite complexity, rewarded those who could perceive these currents, while punishing those who ignored them. A narrow walkway above led to a platform with a view of the chamber's sprawling machinery, where pistons and conduits stretched into darkness, rhythmically pulsating with energy. Sparks flared unpredictably, and residual heat rose in shifting currents that distorted perception. Yet through the chaos, the pulse of the Astronomican offered guidance, faint, irregular, but undeniable. Halric adjusted his pace and gestures to communicate the rhythm, teaching the group to move as an extension of the Hive's own cadence. Survival was no longer a matter of avoidance alone. It was a matter of attunement, a careful harmony with forces that were both tangible and intangible, real and rumored. Even as the immediate danger of fire and collapse receded, the metaphysical stakes grew more pressing. The pulse whispered of alignment, resonance, and perception, the faint, almost spectral presence of the Emperor's will, or perhaps the Hive's own consciousness, threaded through corridors and machinery. Halric sensed that the threshold ahead would demand more than physical skill. It would require interpretation, faith, and the courage to navigate currents that could neither be seen nor touched, only felt. The Hive's depths were alive, sentient in ways that blurred lines between structure and spirit, hazard and guidance, rumor and reality. And so, the group pressed onward deeper into the uncharted territories of Hive Primus, where the pulse of the Astronomican intertwined with shadowed currents, whispering guidance and warning alike. Halric moved with deliberate care, attuned to rhythm, light, vibration, and rumor, aware that the next step could reveal clarity, danger, or revelation. The Underhive had become not merely a landscape of survival, but a crucible of perception, faith, and attunement, where the boundaries of human understanding and distant metaphysical resonance converged in ways that were subtle, dangerous, and inexorably compelling. The corridors narrowed further, the air growing heavier with the combined scent of ozone, soot, and the faint tang of promethium. Sparks danced along corroded conduits, illuminating the twisted forms of machinery that had long since surrendered to entropy. Halric's senses were stretched taut, every vibration beneath his boots, every flicker of light, every hiss of vented steam carrying meaning. The pulse of the Astronomican, though faint and inconsistent, guided him like a subtle current, shaping perception, decision, and movement in ways both immediate and intangible. In Hive Primus, survival had become a matter of attunement rather than brute force. The workers behind him moved cautiously, each footfall synchronized not only with the pulse but with Halric's guidance. Some whispered fragments of liturgy, invoking the Emperor's protection in a space where the very walls seemed to observe and measure. Others spoke of visions glimpsed in reflective metal, fleeting shapes that guided their path. Or so they believed. Halric acknowledged these murmurs silently, aware that perception, rumor, and faith were now inseparable from the act of navigating the Hive. To dismiss them was dangerous. To embrace them without discernment was no less so. The Underhive demanded balance, intuition, and careful interpretation. A sudden shudder ran through the floor, subtle but insistent. Loose metal groaned above, and a shard of piping fell with a metallic clatter, narrowly missing a worker. Halric adjusted the pace, leading the group along a safer route that the pulse hinted at, a pathway that twisted around unseen hazards and collapsed scaffolding. The vibration underfoot resonated faintly in a pattern, almost melodic, a reminder that the Hive's judgment extended beyond immediate danger. Each movement, each choice, carried resonance with forces that were both real and rumored, tangible and spiritual. The pulse, rumor, and perception formed a triad of survival that was inseparable and demanding. Through a narrow junction, Halric glimpsed a small chamber where a group of laborers had set up a makeshift shrine. Candles flickered, incense smoldered, and the symbol of the imperial Aquila had been etched into the walls with painstaking care. The workers knelt in quiet devotion, murmuring prayers for guidance, clarity, and protection. Halric passed without comment, feeling the pulse subtly shift as if acknowledging the act. Faith, in this place, was not mere superstition. It was a practical tool, a means of attuning perception, focus, and decision-making to the currents of the hive and the faint whispers of the Emperor's will. The corridors twisted again,